So, hi everybody. Thanks for having me here to speak today. So my name's Alyssa. I'm going to be talking today about John Brown, who was a radical abolitionist. I'm going to talk for a while. Got me a little slideshow here, and then I'll open it up for questions at the end. However, if anybody feels like they have something that is really pressing that they need to ask right away, raise your hand and I'll get to you. So, okay. Let's see. All right, so here behind me I have John Brown. I'm going to talk about just him in general for a few minutes. He was a bit of an unusual character. He was a deeply, deeply religious man. He could actually recite the entire Bible, like start to finish, completely from memory. However, aside from considering himself a Protestant, he didn't prescribe to any particular Christian denomination. And he was never a church member, which was like really, really unusual for a man in America during that time. So he was born on May 9th, 1800. His parents were abolitionists, and growing up they taught him from a very young age that slavery was wrong and it was evil. Yet for some reason they had befriended this man who was a slave owner, and due to circumstances, John Brown was actually sent to live with this man for a short period of time as a child. And this man owned a slave who was about John Brown's age, and John Brown would routinely witness this slave owner beating this small boy with a shovel. And John Brown felt completely powerless to help his new friend. And that actually really scarred his psyche and shaped a lot of the rest of his life. And when he heard about the death of Elijah Lovejoy, who was a journalist and an abolitionist, John Brown actually attended the next public town meeting and was like, I need to speak in front of the entire town. And he got up and he was like, I dedicate my life to the cause of abolition from here on out. So I'm not sure which one it is, but he's one of those little boys. That's him with his family. So he did dedicate himself to the cause of abolition. However, he was an egalitarian across the board. He believed in racial equality, he believed in class equality, and he believed in gender equality. I also feel the need to point out that he believed in racial egalitarianism because that was not believing in equality and being an abolitionist were not really synonymous during this time period. In fact, most abolitionists did not believe in egalitarianism, and it was actually would be really scandalous in a lot of abolitionist circles because they would hear about some work that John Brown had done, and they approach him and be like, oh yeah, hi, I'm so and so, and I'm working with this newspaper, and I've been doing this and that. And John Brown would be like, you're doing all that? That's awesome. You gotta come to my house. You should just come and stay with me, and we can put our heads together and work on what we're gonna do together, and it'll be oh great. It'd be all gung ho. And they go to his house and be horrified because there would be black people staying in John Brown's house. It would be time for dinner, and they'd come sit at the table with everybody else. And John Brown would address them by their surnames and use the prefix of Mr. And everybody would go running back to their abolitionist circles John Brown's a lunatic. You wouldn't believe the stuff that goes on to his house. So he was quite the radical, that John Brown. As an older man, John Brown moved to Kansas. Not quite yet. Where several of his children who were grown at the time were living in Kansas, so he moved there. And there was a lot of going on politically in Kansas at the time. It was a territory, not yet a state, and it was moving towards statehood. And once it became apparent that Kansas was going to become a state, there was a lot of debate as to whether it would be a free state or a slave state. So a very political occurrence that happened. You guys have probably heard about the caning debacle with Charles Sumner, but I'll go over it a little bit. So there's a senator, his name is Charles Sumner. He's an abolitionist, and he gets up and he gives this speech basically trying to persuade the Senate that Kansas should be made a free state. However, it was the reaction to his speech did not go over so well. He very, vigorously condemned slavery. He kind of was attacking, people who heard it felt like he was attacking the South as a whole. And it was really shocking because he made a lot of very, very thinly veiled references to the fact that slave owners were rampantly, viciously, sexually abusing their slaves, which it wasn't like there was anybody who didn't know that that was going on, but people did not talk about that, especially not in public. And there was a lot of fallout after he gave the talk, but at the next Senate meeting, another senator by the name of Preston Brooks, actually attacked Sumner in front of the entire Senate. And you'll hear that the attack referred to as a caning, which is like true in like only like the most technical sense of the word. The weapon used was this cane that had a very like large, round, solid head, and he actually jumped on Charles Sumner and was like bashing him over the head with this like heavy cane, while another senator held off everybody else with a gun. Everybody else was like trying to jump in and stop them. And Charles Sumner was actually left blinded in one eye as a result of this attack. So this event directly led to what's called the Pottawatomie Massacre. What is known about that is that a group of several men attacked and gathered up several slave owners and slave hunters and shot them in the street. It's alleged that John Brown and one of his sons led this group that did this. For his part, John Brown always said, wasn't me, I wasn't there, I don't know who did it, I had nothing to do with that. And that was always his response whenever this was brought up. What is known is that then directly as a result of it being alleged that John Brown had done this, another lynch mob formed and hanged two of John Brown's sons. Wow. Neither having been it was alleged that one of his sons helped him, but it wasn't that, neither of those two men were that even particular son. When people criticize, a lot of people criticize John Brown, and people that do speak to one or two events, and this is one of them, the Pottawatomie Massacre, and he's criticized for using violence. And I find it very troubling that, given the circumstances of what happened, that anybody would pick out John Brown to condemn for being violent in this situation. The men who it was alleged that he attacked were either, directly partaking in or profiting from both, a system that was, spreading, slavery, murder, violence, and rape. And then this other group comes along and hangs two men who had nothing to do with anything. And nobody really wants to talk about the violence that those people were enacting. It's John Brown who's singled out for being violent. I think that's important to keep in mind. Okay. Sorry, hold on 1 second. Okay. All right, so after his two sons are lynched, John Brown goes on the move because he knows he knows they're coming for him next. So he kind of just decides at this time that he's really not gonna make it out of this alive, and he develops this really dark, callous kind of gallows sense of humor, excuse me. So he's kind of on the move, just staying with any abolitionists that will have him, and he's staying in a house with this married couple, and he hears these rumors, and there's no evidence that there was ever any truth to them, but that these federal marshals have been deployed to arrest him. And the woman who lived in the house found him in her guest room, and he's barricaded all his furniture against the wall, or against the door, and she's like, what are you doing? And he's like, well, Madam, the marshals are coming for me, and I know myself and I know that I will never allow myself to be taken alive. And you've been so kind as to keep me in your home, and I just didn't want to spoil your carpet. So after that, he sets off with this other family who takes him in, and John Brown was a father many times over. By this point, he has several grandchildren, and he goes to stay with this other family who has this small young girl. So when he arrives at this house, he brings her a doll as a present. He gives it to her, and she's like playing with the doll, and then she's playing with him, and he kind of climbs up in her lap, and he's like, you need to remember this moment. It's really important that you remember this right here, because one day they're gonna hang me. And you can tell all your friends that I came and stayed with you and I gave you this doll and you crawled up into my lap, and it'll be this cool story that you can tell all your friends. So I find that pretty humorous. But so John Brown is pretty much convinced at this point that he's gonna die and he's not gonna make it out of this alive. So he decides to completely give the rest of his time left with nothing left to lose to this cause of abolition. And while he always denied any involvement in the Pottawatomie Massacre, he did not condemn violence as a means of ending slavery. And a lot of abolitionists at this time were completely pacifists. He would get into a lot of debates with a lot of abolitionists over this. One of those, I love this picture. One of those abolitionists being Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass knew John Brown. John Brown considered him a very good friend. But Frederick Douglass was a little weary of some of John Brown's ideas. He actually, at the time when they were talking, would always disagree with him and say, no, we need to end slavery through peaceful means only. And I really, I don't even think you'll be able to do what you're talking about trying to pull off here. And, when John Brown eventually began planning and trying to recruit people to aid him on his raid of Harper's Ferry. He didn't know it at the time, but Frederick Douglass was actually like if John Brown was approaching someone like, hey, this is, what we're doing. I think you should talk more with us. We'd love to have you sign up. Frederick Douglass would actually approach him later and be like, yeah, that guy's off his rocker. You don't want to sign up with that John Brown dude. So John Brown develops this plan as to how he is going to lead a raid or lead a movement to end slavery in the United States once and for all. So the plan revolves around this town of Harper's Ferry, which was in Virginia. He picked that town because it had a arsenal there that he felt like he would be able to penetrate and get into this arsenal. His plan originally called for 4,500 people. He did not have that many. We'll get to that later. But so the plan went, okay, so we're going to get a group of guys together. We're going to break into this arsenal. We're going to take all the weapons, and then we're going to just set out and just march. And we're going to march until we find the very first plantation we come to. We're going to go to the slaves, and we're going to arm them. And then we're going to go find the slave owner of the plantation. And we're going to say, okay, well, we're here, and we say you don't have any slaves anymore, okay? And then they would leave the plantation and march on with the hopes that the slaves that they had just liberated would agree to join them, and they march to the next plantation, and they'd do it again and march to the next plantation and do it again with the, until they had a large enough group and they liberated enough people that they could continue and then lead an armed rebellion and slavery. So, his plan called for 4,500 men. In the end, he decided to move forward when he had not yet reached his goal. He only had 21 men, including several of his sons and sons-in-law. And he got into a bit of a discussion with his neighbor when his neighbor found out what he was going to do. He's like, I don't think you're quite prepared enough. You need to be careful. He said, caution, sir. I'm eternally tired of hearing that word caution. It is nothing but the word of a coward. This is a very famous portrait of John Brown. That is, ironically, a gun in one hand and the Bible in the other. So they move on Harper's Ferry and attempt to take this arsenal They were expecting it to be unarmed. Unfortunately, there was a group of Virginia militiamen nearby, and that did not end very well for them. They start having these kind of guerrilla-style shootouts with these militiamen, and within hours, most of his soldiers are dead. And so the survivors are kind of winging it on a plan. So they decide they're going to go take some hostages and then hole up inside this arsenal. So they do get a couple hostages. One of the stories told them was kind of unsubstantiated. One of the accounts is that the armed men, they went to several plantation homes, and they would find the slave owners, and they'd have their guns. They're like, oh, we're here with guns because we're here to rob you, and we want you to give us all your money. And they, give them whatever they wanted. So then they take all their money and their valuables, and they go and they distribute among the slaves and say, this is yours now. And then they drag the slave owners off into this arsenal. That was what some of the stories said. So anyway, they wind up with several hostages inside this arsenal where they're holed up. And one of the hostages, he was actually a descendant of George Washington. And he and several others would talk later about they were very, very unsure how to feel about John Brown the entire time they were sort of in this hostage situation. They said he kind of took on this very strange persona of this differential host, and he sent one of his men, he snuck out of the arsenal and went to this nearby bed and breakfast, and they came back with this delicious breakfast spread, and he's like, hey everybody, we got some food, and he sat down and they all had breakfast together, and the whole time John Brown's like, so really this is all I'm saying, this is all I'm trying to do, come on, you can see where I'm coming from, right? And he was they were kind of weary of him the whole time and not really sure what to make while he's trying to debate them on theological levels. So a couple things are going on at this time. So John Brown's holed up with all these hostages inside this arsenal. Word gets to the president that there's a massive slave rebellion where hundreds of slaves are risen up and are killing all their masters. So he sends a group composed of several militiamen and a couple of militias and a couple of groups of Marines out to go to Virginia to Harper's Ferry to kind of quash this massive slave rebellion that he's hearing about. So that's going on. And meanwhile, the initial Virginia militiamen who had the shootout with John Brown are they decide, since John Brown and his hostages are holed up inside the arsenal, they're just going to go get drunk. So they go get trashed, and then they come back, and John Brown's men who had been killed before, their corpses are lying on the ground at Harper's Ferry. And these militiamen decide that they're going to amuse themselves by mutilating the dead bodies. So he was not yet a general, but at the time he was a colonel. Colonel Robert E. Lee is actually the one who the President Buchanan, sent out leading the military troops. And when they arrive, they find these corpses on the ground. And Robert E. Lee is this hard military man from a long line of military men, and he threw up on the yard at Harper's Ferry because he was so sickened at the viciousness and the horror of these crazed racist Virginia militiamen, and he's he's literally sickened. Okay. Now I want to talk. Oh, that was old. Sorry. For a few minutes about these two guys right here. This is Owen Brown and Watson Brown. So when they had the initial shootout with the Virginia militiamen, Watson Brown is shot. But he doesn't die. And John Brown kind of drags him inside the arsenal with him. And he was alive for several hours. And he started begging his father to put a bullet into his head and kill him. And people who were there, the story goes that John Brown picked up his son and he sat him down in the corner. And he said, son, you're about to die, and you better die like a man. And he left him there, which is the harsh story. However, immediately after Watson dies, John Brown goes to Owen. And he said, look, they took your two brothers. Watson's dead now. I'm going to save you. You're my last son I got left. I'm going to save you. And when Robert E. Lee shows up, he sent his son outside unarmed and carrying a white flag. And Robert E. Lee ordered that he be shot on sight, and he was. Within a few minutes, he asked John Brown, hey, you know, really, we don't need to do all this. Why don't you just surrender? John Brown was like, you just killed my son in front of me. Come in here and get me, and I'm going to kill as many of you as I can before I'm killed myself. Robert E. Lee leads a charge. Within minutes, almost everybody is either arrested or shot. John Brown, who was always so adamant that he would never be taken alive, was actually hit over the head and knocked unconscious and was dragged outside of the arsenal. Once he awoke, he was arrested and charged with both treason and murder. So here is a newspaper clipping from the time shortly after his arrest, asking for people to pray for and support John Brown. His cause is very controversial at the time. People in the South are pissed and they want his blood. They want his head on a silver platter. Northerners and abolitionists are more conflicted amongst themselves. Some of them were all behind John Brown. Some were some were more hesitant about his use of violence and were a little unsure as to whether or not they should support him. However, his strongest support actually came from overseas, and here we have it in the form of French novelist and politician Victor Hugo. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Let America know and ponder this. There is something more frightening than Cain killing Abel, and that is Washington killing Spartacus." Another quote he once said about the matter was that the U.S. putting John Brown on trial was akin to America. He said, Americans are trying to kill their glory in order to support their shame, shaming the institution of slavery and probably Virginia in particular. So we had a lot of support coming in from overseas. People at home were a little more divided. John Brown, at this point, he doesn't seem to care at all about his own life. Anytime he got a chance to speak at his trial, he wouldn't even bother to try to defend himself. He spent every moment that he was given in the courtroom trying to persuade the jury that slavery was evil and needed to be abolished. Like, the closest he came to even kind of somewhat defending himself was he at one point kind of sarcastically quipped to the jury. He said, you know what, if I had done what I'd done for anybody else, you guys would be sitting there trying to figure out how to best reward me and not deciding whether or not you were going to end my life. As for his lawyer, as far as the murder charge, he argued that there was never any evidence that John Brown himself personally killed anybody. There's no evidence that he shot anybody, during any of the shootouts. There's no evidence he ever did actually fire his gun. For all we know, he never did kill anybody. Kind of a sad but true argument as far as the treason charge goes, because the treason related to a slave insurrection. His lawyer argued that there actually never had been a slave insurrection because they never actually successfully convinced any of the slaves to join them. He said, everybody who joined his movement was a free man. They can be held responsible only for themselves. The jury, however, did not agree, and he was in fact found guilty on both accounts and was sentenced to death. John Brown didn't care. In a letter home after he was sentenced, he said, "Oh, let them hang me. I'm worth inconceivably more to hang than I am for any other purpose." This is actually a sketch drawn by an eyewitness who was there the day. That is, in fact, a sketch of John Brown's body hanging. Another witness who was actually there that day was Henry David Thoreau. And he said, "Some 1,800 years ago, Christ was crucified. This morning, John Brown was hung. He's not old Brown any longer. He is an angel of light." And this is a painting that was drawn of him as he's being led out to be executed. So here's a little bit about John Brown's legacy today. Yeah, I love that. So he tends to be pretty much either loved or reviled. Some historians have gone so far as to label him America's first domestic terrorist. Kansas has John Brown on a lot of their album art. He, in fact, they wrote a song about him titled "Carry On My Wayward Son." If you've heard it, it's a pretty good one. It's kind of interesting. For a long time, John Brown was actually used as like a euphemism, it was used like as a curse word. Like the phrase you would hear the most was like, "I'll be John Brown," and it was like an equate to saying like, "I'll be damned." I think it's pretty obvious from a revolutionary standpoint that John Brown was a great American hero. But it's really interesting because if you look at the arguments against him, they really just don't ever, they don't really hold up under any kind of scrutiny. People who do criticize him for being either both treasonous or violent. And, even if you were to, remove the horrors of the oppression and the rampant, murder and violence that was going on in the country at the time, if you take it all and put it down just into this little microcosm of what was going on there that day at Harper's Ferry, John Brown was the least violent and treasonous person who was even there. It was these violent militiamen were the ones who were getting joy out of mutilating dead bodies, and meanwhile Robert E. Lee is there trying to put a stop to everything. Within 2 years of John Brown's death, Robert E. Lee was leading an armed military, trying to fight against the United States, wherein these Union troops were marching, literally singing the song "John Brown's Body," which we're going to hear a little bit later. Additionally, I was trying to read and find different points of view on him and stuff, and you don't really come across at least many historians who will criticize John Brown and then turn around and criticize Abraham Lincoln as well. John Brown tried to start a war to free the slaves, and he's hated for it. Abraham Lincoln started a war, freed the slaves, and he's considered a great American hero. All right, so that is what I had to say about John Brown. That's my opinion. However, I want to leave us with the opinion of someone who's a little more qualified than me to speak on that, and that is Mr. Frederick Douglass. So after John Brown's death, remember I mentioned it before, but Frederick Douglass had actually kind of been somewhat sabotaging John Brown's efforts, and he really had a change of heart. He said, "His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bound by time, his stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him." So I just wanted to end on that quote because I find it very powerful, and I think coming from Frederick Douglass, he knew John Brown, he was there, and so that's really all I had to say, and I'm happy to take anybody's questions. Did you have something?
I was just thinking about something. Sorry.
Okay.
What's the other one?
Oh, yes. Sorry, Adrian.
That's more of a comment than a question. I just wanted to say, wow, John Brown was a G.
John Brown was a G. Someone put that on a t-shirt. Yes. Oh, I would very much agree with that. Yeah.
What were you saying about when he went to do his raid?
Mm-hmm.
Did they make it to any plantations, or they were intercepted by the militia before they?
Okay. Yes, I might not have been very clear about that. So they ran into these militiamen before they actually made it to any plantations, and they were having a couple shootouts throughout this town, and so several of his men were shot before they ever made it to any plantation. So then, when they were, they realized they weren't going to be able to make it out of Harper's Ferry with these militiamen there. So then they were kind of winging it, going on Plan B. And at that point, those who had survived did manage to sneak off to several plantations and gather up several slave owners to keep as hostages. And then they went to the arsenal and barricaded themselves inside. Does that clears that up a little bit? Okay, yeah. Sorry if I was unclear about the way that happened. Yes.
It's just a weird anecdote, and I think it was about John Brown, but didn't he have some sort of weird relationship about disciplining his children, in which whenever his children did something bad, he would ask him to cut 2 switches. One so he could whip his children, and the other one so they could whip him for being a bad parent.
What?
Yes, that's true. I have heard that.
I don't know if that's true. I've heard it.
I have heard that as an anecdote. I'm not sure if that was ever something he talked about or if it came from his children. I have heard it as an anecdote. I've never heard him talking about why that was what he chose to do. But yeah, I did hear that. That is a historical, historical anecdote.
So you have heard that?
Oh yeah, I have heard that. I never heard him talk as to why he chose to do that. But yeah, in the barn, they would go to the barn to do it. I don't know why in the barn either, but it would be in the barn.
Well, at least he can make good on the, like, this is going to hurt you as much as it
I suppose so.
So, like, that's not true. We all know that's not true. It's like, no, I'm going to give it to you.
Okay.
I failed you, son.
Yes. Oh, great.
I was also wondering, I think I remember I thought it was John Brown, like in a history class maybe in high school, they said that like while he was in Kansas, I thought like, you mentioned the one Pottawatomie thing.
Potawatomi
I
Massacre.
heard something about like, he had a whole history of butchering slave owners in the night or something while he was living in Kansas, like not just one incident, but many, many times. Break into a slave owner's house in Kansas and kill them.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know if you'd ever heard about that.
I have not heard that. The only incident I ever heard of him, prior to the raid on Harper's Ferry, the only incident I ever heard it being alleged of him was the Pottawattamie Massacre, which, like I said, he always denied being in. I'm sorry?
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that kind of got hyped up, like
It could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you really call the execution of a bunch of slave owners and slavers a massacre?
Well, I mean, you can, because that's the thing they called it. Yeah, no, I mean, I use, the phrase being that's what it was known as, the Pottawatomie Massacre, as a, historical event. Yeah, and I mean, I guess it would depend on what you call massacre too. I mean, they were all, I didn't include it in the reports, I could be mistaken, so I'm not going to swear to this, but I'm just going off of memory, I think it was 4 slave owners and 2 slave hunters. Yeah, I'm not shedding no tears, but yeah.
It's a massacre. It's a good massacre.
It's a good massacre.
Such
Yes.
a thing.
Yeah, a massacre, family bonding experience for John Brown and his son, until the 2 other sons got lynched for it. But yeah. Teach them a trade. Okay, well, yeah, oh yes.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't like necessarily an isolated incident either. Do you care to speak at all to the sort of political, I mean, you mentioned that it was kind of up in the air as to whether or not it was a slave state, but it wasn't a huge, sort of a battleground. It was labeled Bloody Kansas.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Well, when I said it was up in the air over whether or not it was a slave state, it's because it wasn't a state, it was a territory. So they didn't have state laws on slavery. And that's why it was so violent and so heated in this deal between, Sumner and Brooks, because they were saying, we're gonna make a state, we're gonna draft, a state constitution. Are we gonna have slavery in a constitution or are we not? And, the people that had their slaves very much wanted to keep them, and the people that were against that were very much against that, and hence all the rampant violence, even in the Senate floor.
the good old days of civil discourse, right?
Yes, civil discourse. Oh my God, I'm trying to imagine just like now, just like watching like C-SPAN, and suddenly like one guy's like on somebody else with a club, and then everybody gets up, and the other guy because I think I don't remember the name of the guy that pulled the gun, but yeah, because everybody Brooks is like beating Sumner over the head, and all the senators get up, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And this other guy like pulls his gun out, and he said, "Leave them be," and then everybody's just like standing there watching at gunpoint, which is.
I wish that was C-SPAN.
Ian wishes that was C-SPAN. Very well.
Bring back death matches for Congress. I think that would really
Bring back? I think we should bring back death matches for Congress and the winners executed.
The bill gets passed, but you died.
Those states are just, I mean, it just illustrates how hardcore racist those states are and still entrenched, you know, to this day. Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, like, historically, and all the way up to this day are still, you know, I guess the whole country, even Alaska, but not so much. You know? But
I don't know why you had to throw in
Kansas
just kidding. I can get behind that. Yeah.
Kansas is just as bad as in like southern state, Alabama, and Mississippi, or whatever. Just as bad. And Missouri as well. And Oklahoma.
Yep.
There's no people who live there.
All right. Any other questions?
All right, so
Okay.
please thank Alyssa with a round of applause.
Oh, thank you.